Greetings and salutations, everybody. It's I, XLJ, the OG from Cole TV, and welcome back to Back in the Day. Now here on Back in the Day, we like to take a look back at the rich history of World Championship Wrestling and highlight some of the greatest rivalries, matches, moments, and look at some of that beautiful, beautiful merch. But as always, though, we like to start off with our top story. And our top story this week, we are going all the way back to 1997, August the 4th, for that infamous WCW Nitro, where Lex Luger dethroned Hollywood Hulk Hogan and brought the WCW title back home to World Championship Wrestling. So, as we all know, the NWO dominated World Championship Wrestling all throughout 1996 and 1997. And it just seemed like they just won over and over and over again because they did. I mean, they just dominated the top. You would have some moments here and there where WCW guys would get wins, but the one thing they always had a grasp on was that WCW World Heavyweight Championship, which did not leave Hollywood Hogan's hands ever since he won it at Hog Wild 1996 against the Giant. And even though the NWO was dominating, there was still one man, one crusader from World Championship Wrestling who would go to Herculean and superhuman-like efforts to stop the New World Order, and that man being the total package, Lex Luger. And I find it interesting when you look back at it in hindsight, before the NWO storyline started, Lex Luger wasn't really like the most popular babyface on the roster of WCW. I mean, it was really like Sting and the Macho Man and Hulk Hogan even before he turned heel. So it's interesting that out of those guys, Lex Luger would kind of be the crusader for WCW. Now, of course, this makes sense since Sting was, obviously, they were keeping him off TV to kind of build that rivalry with the NWO. But Lex Luger was on the front lines. He was there week in and week out defending World Championship Wrestling from the New World Order. And you would always get these amazing moments with Lex Luger where, like, he would, like I say, do these superhuman things. Like, I'll never forget World War III 1996 when it's literally 4 members of the NWO against Lex Luger, and Luger eliminates 3 of the 4 members, and you think he's going to win the World War III Battle Royal, but the Giant ultimately did end up winning that matchup. But man, just the power that he showed, tossing 6 and eliminating Scott Hall and Kevin Nash, and hell, even getting the Giant up in a torture rack. And then if you fast forward and look at Uncensored 1997, in that team concept matchup that they had, it was literally Lex Luger by himself against the entire New World Order, and yet he eliminated the Macho Man, Scott Hall, and Kevin Nash. It was down to him and Hulk Hogan. However, the Hulkster would prevail. But Lex Luger was just, you knew Lex Luger could be the guy to carry the flagship for WCW and be the one to bring that WCW World title back to WCW. So Luger would just fight off different members of the NWO on a weekly basis, essentially, and would go on to the Spring Stampede 1997 pay-per-view, where he would win a Fatal 4-Way match involving his partner at the time, the Giant, and Harlem Heat, where he would be announced as the #1 contender for the WCW World title. However, before he got to that World Championship title matchup, it just so happened to be that Luger would team with the Giant to go up against Hollywood Hogan and Dennis Rodman in a mega main event at Bash at the Beach 1997. Now, if you look at the pattern of these WCW pay-per-views in this time frame, it was pretty much always ended with the NWO in raising their hands in victory. Very rarely did a WCW guy win. However, on this night, it just so happened to be Luger and the Giant would pick up the win for World Championship Wrestling. So after this tremendous matchup at Bash at the Beach, it was time for Lex Luger to get his World Heavyweight Championship matchup. And all signs were pointing to Road Wild 1997, which ironically would be pretty much a year to the day almost after Hulk Hogan had won the WCW World title, where Lex Luger would challenge Hollywood Hulk Hogan. However, interestingly enough, WCW Commissioner James J. Dillon would announce that Hollywood Hogan had not defended his World Heavyweight Championship within the 30-day time frame that a champion is supposed to defend that belt. I'm looking at you, Roman Reigns. I'm just saying. So, James J. said Hollywood Hogan was contractually obligated to defend that World Heavyweight Championship against Lex Luger a week before the pay-per-view at WCW Nitro. Which really was shocking that they would put this this huge main event matchup on television. But you gotta keep in mind, this is the height of the Monday Night Wars, and both WCW and WWF were willing to do just about anything to get a good rating. And boy, oh boy, did this episode get a great rating for WCW. I'll never forget watching this as a kid, man. I was glued on the edge of my seat. I was always rooting for WCW in this war against the NWO just because they got their ass kicked so many times. It's just like, come on, just give them a moment for crying out loud. And of course, going into this matchup, you're like, okay, Hogan's gonna retain. We all know what's gonna happen here. But, surprisingly, that did not happen, as Lex Luger would get Hollywood Hogan up in the torture rack. And I'll never forget the look on Randy Anderson's face when he calls for it and signals that Hogan gives up and thus loses the WCW title. And finally, the WCW title is returned to World Championship Wrestling, and Lex Luger would win the WCW title. I'll never forget the images in the ring with all the WCW roster coming out, pretty much celebrating with Luger. It was truly a tremendous moment. And you know what? Honestly, Lex Luger deserved this moment because Lex Luger was busting his ass in WCW this time frame. Say what you will about Lex Luger, but me personally, I've always been a fan of Luger's, and I think he totally deserved to be the guy to take the title away from Hollywood Hulk Hogan. Now, there would be some blemishes, though, I think, about this title reign. Mainly the fact that Luger only held it for, I believe it was 6 days, as he would drop the belt back to Hollywood Hogan at the Road Wild pay-per-view, where they were originally supposed to meet in the first place. So it was a very, very short run. The other blemish, really, I think, being is the fact is, we were, this close to getting Hogan against Sting, so we knew that was coming and on the horizon. So I think because of that, we knew the Great Crusader Sting was going to come forward and be the one to dethrone the NWO. So knowing that, I think a little bit of the luster was taken away from this historic title change. And of course, once again, it didn't help that he only held the belt for 6 days. And it almost makes you wonder why they pulled the trigger for the title change, which I really think ultimately was just to pop a rating. Because I think, hell, if this matchup would have happened at the Road Wild pay-per-view, probably would have been a different outcome than the Nitro match, where Hogan probably would have retained. And also, too, it was okay, well, Hogan had a stranglehold on that belt, and once you get to the Starrcade later that year, which was literally a couple months away, I felt maybe a little bit of the luster that was there for Sting to win the world title. It was just kind of it just showed that Hogan wasn't as unstoppable as we all thought he was. But still, nonetheless, this is a historic moment in World Championship Wrestling. Let's not forget that Lex Luger was the guy who stopped the reign of Hollywood Hogan first. And that, my friends, is our top story of the week here on Back in the Day. Now, here on Back in the Day, we like to take a look at some of the greatest matches in the history of World Championship Wrestling. And today, I have what I would consider a hidden gem of a matchup, because this is a phenomenal matchup that not nearly enough people talk about. I want to take you back to WCW's Fall Brawl 1995 pay-per-view and the opening contest between Johnny B. Bad and Flying Brian Pillman. Now, this matchup, it was actually to determine who would be the new #1 contender for the United States Championship, which at the time was held by Sting. So pretty much this matchup, you have just got two white meat baby faces who, let's call a spade, they were mid-card wrestlers at this time frame, competing for a shot at that U.S. Championship. And this matchup is amazing, because this is a matchup where, yes, you've got babyface against babyface, but it's just great in-ring wrestling, a lot of great aerial maneuvers, and just we say this before and we'll say it again on this show, the chemistry between Johnny B. Bad and Flying Brian was there. Johnny B. Bad is one of those wrestlers who just doesn't get nearly enough credit, and he was a huge part of World Championship Wrestling in the mid-90s. His character started off in a very flamboyant fashion, but just his in-ring skills ultimately, I think, won him over with the WCW crowd. And of course, can't say enough great things about the late, great Flying Brian Pillman. Now, at this point, like, Brian, I mean, he's still doing the high-flying stuff, but it's not nearly like he was, of course, due to injuries and whatnot. But still, Brian could go. And this matchup is awesome. It actually goes to the time limit draw, so they have to go into like a sudden death overtime to determine the winner. And ultimately, Johnny B. Badd would win this matchup. But I mean, this matchup went close to about 30 minutes, which back then, that was unheard of, especially on pay-per-view. But man, this is like one of the best opening matchups I think I've ever seen on a WCW card, especially at this time frame. And for whatever reason, I think a lot of people tend to forget about this matchup. But man, this is a hell of a matchup, and I highly encourage you to check it out because it's our match of the week here on Back in the Day. Now, we always like to take a look at some of the great rivalries throughout the history of World Championship Wrestling. And today we're going to take a look at a very intense rivalry. However, I will give you a huge disclaimer on this rivalry because it does involve a person who, well, has pretty much been blackballed for the professional wrestling industry, and rightfully so, but still, keep in context, we are taking a look at the rivalry and the matchup between these individuals. We're not talking about the individuals outside of the wrestling world, so I can't stress that enough. But the feud we're going to take a look at is one between Taskmaster Kevin Sullivan and Chris Benoit. Now, this rivalry is interesting in how it really got started because there is a significant amount of real-life heat that was brought into this matchup. Now, at the time, the Four Horsemen and the Dungeon of Doom were still kind of working together as they were, going to war against the Hulkamania, which at this point, let's call a spade, that shit had run the course. So, this rivalry really was stemmed off some real-life heat between Benoit and Kevin Sullivan. Mainly because Kevin Sullivan's ex-wife was the late, great Nancy Benoit, a.k.a. Woman, who was with the Four Horsemen and was managing Chris Benoit. And once again, I know this is a touchy subject because of what happened many years later, but I can't stress enough, just trying to keep in the context of this time frame in 1996. So the idea behind this, essentially, like with the backstage heat between these two, is the fact that, like, Woman, who is Kevin Sullivan's ex-wife, is now with Chris Benoit, and the jealousy between them, as well as the fact that Kevin Sullivan at the time was the booker in World Championship Wrestling. So almost as if it was like keeping the thumb down on talent, and especially on Chris Benoit, given the set of circumstances. And both these guys are physical as hell, too. So really, like, kind of one of the first pivotal moments in this rivalry is when they were drawn to be a part of a tag team together at the Slamboree 1996 as part of the Lethal Lottery. Now, of course, they could not coexist and would go on and lose in Slamboree. And the rivalry really kicked up the notch at the Great American Bash 1996. And what a lot of people say stole the show that year, which this is a great pay-per-view. There's some great matches on this show. But it was the Falls Count Anywhere matchup between Chris Benoit and Kevin Sullivan. And this would kind of be like a reoccurring theme about when they would have matchups on pay-per-views, and they'd just be these wild, insane brawls where they would just go all over throughout the arena. And keep in mind, too, in this time frame in 1996, you just did not see that on WCW or WWF television. And I'll never forget with the call on this with Dusty Rhodes, pretty much, and Benoit and Sullivan end up in the woman's bathroom, and Dusty Rhodes just is going like crazy, like, "They're in the woman's bathroom, baby!" It was like he was having like just this insane, like he could not believe what he was seeing, or the rest of us could. I'll never forget too when Kevin Sullivan practically threw Chris Benoit down a flight of stairs. It's just like in the arena, it's just crazy. Now ultimately, this matchup would come down to Arn Anderson of the Four Horsemen coming out and making a save for Chris Benoit, and thus showing his alliance to Benoit. And now the Dungeon of Doom was going to go to war with the Four Horsemen because of this, as Arn Anderson would cost Kevin Sullivan the match. You also got to keep in mind, too, the Dungeon of Doom is in possession of the most coveted prize in World Championship Wrestling at this time, the WCW title, as the Giant is the WCW champion. So you fast forward to a month later at the Bash at the Beach 1996 pay-per-view, and there's a tag match that's held between the Dungeon of Doom and the Four Horsemen. Of course, representing the Horsemen is Chris Benoit and Arn Anderson, and they're going up against Kevin Sullivan and the Giant. Now, the stipulation for this match was, if the Horsemen won, pretty much Ric Flair would get a shot at the World Heavyweight Championship. Or I think they said the Four Horsemen, but come on, we all knew Flair was going to be the one to get that shot. This is a fun tag team matchup. They do some isolation on the Giant before the match, essentially, and are working over Taskmaster Kevin Sullivan. Of course, the Giant would finally come out and then just pretty much whip ass, and the Dungeon of Doom would win this matchup. But trust me, this feud was far from over between Chris Benoit and Kevin Sullivan. Now, keep in mind, of course, at this point, we're talking Bash at the Beach 96, and the NWO is pretty much taken over in all of the storylines. So you have, essentially, friend and foe teaming up in WCW to go up against the NWO, but I can tell you this, it didn't stop Benoit and Kevin Sullivan from beating the hell out of each other, essentially. And Sullivan would utilize some of his members from the Dungeon of Doom to help in his war against Chris Benoit. Like, if you fast forward several months later, I'll never forget a series of matches between Ming and Chris Benoit. And oh my gosh, the physicality on this one. I mean, anytime anybody's going against Haku, they're pretty much going to be on the short end of an ass beating, but oh man, these matches these two guys had was incredible. Now, at this point too, Kevin Sullivan does actually get somebody to counteract woman's counterpart in this rivalry, as he brings in one Miss Jackie, or Jacqueline, who is the manager for Kevin Sullivan, essentially. And I will say this too, really, it's like this point, Dungeon of Doom's still around, but it's just like, they're just there, essentially. I mean, Kevin Sullivan's mostly just focused on beating the hell out of them. So you go to Super Brawl 7, and I'll never forget this San Francisco Death Match. As great as the Great American Bash match was, me personally, I kind of like this one slightly better. It was just like the drama of it was just intense, man, because these guys beat the holy hell out of each other for like 10 minutes plus. And the finish of the match, I think, on the finish of the match, it pretty much is just like Kevin Sullivan's like unconscious, essentially. Hell, even Jacqueline is unconscious, and you've got like woman crying for like Kevin Sullivan because he's just been beaten to a pulp, essentially. It's just, these guys always just had such this crazy, realistic vibe when they were in there. It was like, you really felt like they wanted to just pretty much end each other's careers, and would ultimately get a matchup at Bash at the Beach 1997 in what would be deemed as a loser must retire matchup. And this was another one of those crazy Falls Count Anywhere, just brawling all throughout the damn building. And essentially, Chris Benoit would win this matchup and thus win the rivalry, and Kevin Sullivan would retire. Now, to my knowledge, I believe in actuality this was Kevin Sullivan's last match, at least in WCW, that is. He may have wrestled on some independents, from that time frame, but this is the last time I ever really truly remember seeing the Taskmaster like on camera wrestling in the ring. But like I say, they used a lot of reality-based themes, which, keep in mind, that's what WCW is doing this time frame, especially with that NWO storyline. So this is just another one of those great rivalries. And once again, I can't stress enough, we're definitely not talking about the individuals outside of the ring. We're just talking about the in-ring work and the story being told between these individuals. Of course, it is so unfortunate what happened in real life, but I can't stress enough, the story itself in WCW in this time frame it was one of the top rivalries. And it's our rivalry of the week here on Back in the Day. Now, if you follow me on socials, you know I'm a huge collector. And one of the things that I love to collect is wrestling magazines. Here on Back in the Day, we always like to take a look back at some of these great wrestling magazines throughout the years. And for today's magazine, we're going to be taking a look at the April 1992 edition of WCW Magazine. Let's take a look. Alright, there you see it, the April 92 magazine. As you can see, this is a preview of Super Brawl 2 and the epic main event of Lex Luger going up against Sting. Also, got a big giant pullout of the Steiner Brothers. Oh, look at this, the threat to Rude's U.S. title, Ricky the Dragon Steamboat. Oh, Paulie Dangerously, I'll destroy WCW brick by brick. And 10 questions for Johnny B. Bad. And there's a special section on the WCW in the UK. Let's check it out. Oh, here's a wrap-up of things that have most recently happened in World Championship Wrestling. And folks, you can see it here. They are highlighting the Battle Bowl Battle Royal from WCW Starrcade 1991. Oh, check this out. Terry Taylor, Bobby Eaton, look at them short shorts, and Arn Anderson hanging out on the WCW Bruise Cruise, which if you don't remember, the Bruise Cruise was a cruise you could take with the stars of World Championship Wrestling. It lasted like 4 days or something like that. But a pretty cool concept, I always thought, the Bruise Cruise, and the WWF did one as well. Oh, look at Fan Jam, and look at Cactus Jack laughing at the February 1992 issue. Not sure why, but hey, it's Cactus Jack. And here you see Ricky Steamboat and Dustin Rhodes, who had won the World Tag Team titles at the Clash of the Champions 17. And here we go. Front row ringside. Look, there's the Great Muta, a big fan Vader. And yes, that's Jimmy Jam Garvin with a haircut on a beach. Oh, yo baby, ouch! PN News looks like he got his ass beat. It looks like Mr. Hughes was beating the hell out of PN News. I guess he didn't like his rap. I always love the Who Am I? You may not realize it to look at me, but I'm a 16-year veteran of the Mat Wars. Growing up, I was a 2-time Florida State Wrestling Champion. I started thinking of a pro career after seeing Olympic gold medalist turned pro Chris Taylor on Wide World of Sports. I'm a former world champion, 3-time U.S. champion, and 6-time tag champion. I own and operate my own gym in North Carolina. I think I know who it is. Do you? And look at this young man, Marcus Alexander Bagwell. God, look at that haircut, man. That's crazy. And here you go. Program guide for World Championship Wrestling. Can't forget to check out the WCW Power Hour at 9:05 a.m. And, of course, every Saturday, WCW Saturday Night, 6:05. And the main event on Sundays at 6:05. Just does my heart good to see, like, those 05 time slots. Well, this is from the debut issue of Marvel Comics. I thought a fan did that at first. I was like, damn, that's good. Well, that's kind of cool to see that, because remember, WCW would release a series of comics through Marvel, which we have talked about before here on Back in the Day. And yes, don't be deceived, that is Scott Hall, or a.k.a. the Diamond Stud. Man, what can I say? It was the 90s. My goodness, look at this young Paul Heyman, a.k.a. Paulie Dangerously, at the China Club. Got the big cell phone, of course. Oh, man, look at the shoes, the gaiters. All have the drip. Oh, hear me out. Uh-oh, looks like they're talking to the deadly Cactus Jack. Conducted an interview with him, and at the time, interestingly enough, he was in a feud with Van Hammer. Aich. Oh, check out this spotlight. Jushin Thunder Liger against Flying Brian Pillman. This was one of the great rivalries and matches in WCW. Now, this matchup they're talking about is actually when Jushin Liger would dethrone Flying Brian for the WCW Light Heavyweight Championship. Just these matches, you talk about ahead of their times, that is exactly what this rivalry was between Pillman and Liger. I mean, you talk about some of the greatest high flyers in all of World Championship Wrestling, and not only World Championship Wrestling, wrestling, period. Oh, and he's a bad man. 10 questions for Johnny B. Bad. For example, do you regret giving up your boxing career? No, not really. Now, and as I said, at this stage in 91 here into 92, Johnny B. Bad was playing more of that flamboyant character. It would be years later, really, like where Johnny would just really be known for his in-ring work. But he did a hell of a job as his character too, and I mean he owned it. And I can't see anybody else playing Johnny B. Bad. Oh, here we go. It's the Super Brawl 2 preview, Luger versus Sting, an in-depth preview. And man, this rivalry was epic. I remember watching this as a kid. There you see Luger sneaking out of the gift box for Sting at the Clash of the Champions, attacking Sting. All the stuff that happened up until then, Sting dropping the U.S. title to Rude. Of course, they're talking about the injury he had back in 1990, and Luger kind of filling in for him. So there was a lot of depth to this rivalry. And there you see the besties working out together. Now, it also talks about other matches on the card, too, for Super Brawl 2, which there were some great matches on that card. The Steiners against Arn Anderson and Bobby Eaton. You had Ricky Steamboat against Rick Rude, just to name a few. Oh, and here it is, the big color pullout with Scott Steiner. God, look at that baby Scott Steiner, man. And there's that dog-faced gremlin. And here we go, a story on WCW over in Europe. UK fans give American superstars a royal welcome. And apparently UK fans love Michael P.S. Hayes. Ah, look at that, man. Paulie Dangerously. His Dangerous Alliance going to destroy WCW brick by brick. Here you see them carrying the United States champion and the centerpiece of the Dangerous Alliance, Ravishing Rick Rude. There's the late, great, beautiful Bobby wrestling against Ricky Steamboat. What a great matchup that was. And oh, Paul E getting involved against the Stinger. Of course, we mentioned earlier, Sting dropped the U.S. title to Ravishing Rick Rude. Oh my God, look at that. Now that's a babyface Steve Austin. Yes, this man will become a menace and the biggest draw in all professional wrestling several years later. How crazy is that? You know, a pivotal piece of the Dangerous Alliance that doesn't get talked about nearly enough is Medusa and the impact she had as being the corner person for the Dangerous Alliance. And it's still crazy to me to think the Dangerous Alliance was such a short-lived faction, but in the short time frame they were together, less than a year, they made such a huge impact that it still resonates with wrestling fans to this day as one of the greatest factions of all time. Oh, Ravishing Rick, you got that U.S. belt, but the Dragon be calling as Ricky the Dragon Steamboat as part of that intense rivalry with Rick Rude, which we've talked about before here on Back in the Day as well, as one of the great rivalries of all time. And of course, this was kind of a build-up to their very first U.S. title match at Super Brawl 2. Ooh, the Third Degree with the Tailor-Made Man, Terrence Taylor. And at this time frame, Terrence Taylor was managed by Christian York, a.k.a. Marlena, as part of the York Foundation. I love this. They called him the computerized man of the 90s. He went from the Red Rooster to the computerized man. And poor Terry Taylor got some shit gimmicks throughout the year, but you know what? He made it work, all things considered. And Terry Taylor is like one of the great wrestlers, and he's another guy that doesn't really get enough credit. Here we go, some out and about picks, and a lot of these are going to be from the Bruise Cruise. Look at Sting all dressed up and dapper. And obviously, Mr. Hughes is wearing his Sunday's best as well. There's a bad man. The ladies love him. Oh, look at Dustin Rhodes, man, over here. Look at that smile. Oh, there's Flying Brian. It's like, oh man, look at Scott Steiner rocking them shorty shorts and that fanny pack. I love the 90s, man. Look, and there's the Tailor-Made Man playing a little volleyball with the ladies. Oh, look, Scotty Steiner getting him some ice cream. And there's Terry Taylor talking it up with some young ladies. Look at the Stinger with a little Stinger. Here we go. The eyes have it. Can you tell who the wrestler is by looking them into their eyes? Yep, I know number 2. Oh, you know number 3. I think I know who 4 is. Oh, you know who number 5 is. Oh, and our parting shot with Dustin Rhodes playing some baseball. And man, this reminds me of a picture I've seen before of his dad, Dusty, playing like at a charity softball event too, man. Of course, one last ad for the big Super Brawl 2 coming up from the Mecca in Milwaukee on February the 29th of 1992. So WCW Magazine from April 1992 is our magazine of the week here on Back in the Day. Now here on Back in the Day, we like to take a look back at some of the coolest and most unique merchandise throughout the history of World Championship Wrestling. And today, we've got some pretty unique stuff we're going to take a look at. We're going to take a look at some WCW watches from 1991. These watches was produced by a company called Hope, and they had 4 different varieties to choose from. You could get a Sting watch, a Lex Luger, a Ric Flair, or a Sid Vicious watch. And what was really cool about them is it's like a little 4-inch, 3-inch wrestling figure, kind of like on the watch itself, and you gotta lift up on the wrestling figure to see the time. So I can't imagine wearing these things around, but at the same time too, this was the 90s, and they produced stuff like this all the time. I think the WWF even had some watches like this that had the Ultimate Warrior and Hulk Hogan on them. So you had the flip top on these, and these watches had 5 function ports. Punctuality. Function. Whatever the hell that means. But you truly showed your colors if you was rocking one of these WCW watches back then. I think pretty much at the time frame when these watches actually was released, Sid had already left the WCW and was now Sid Justice in the WWF. But man, oh man, you were the coolest kid in your class if you have one of these awesome WCW watches. And I gotta say, now that I've seen these, I think this is up there with the hero heads for me of something I'm going to have to collect and own someday. Well, that's going to about wrap it up for this episode of Back in the Day. And hey, if you like some of the great, amazing content that's coming to you here on World Championship Wreckage, then why don't you just go ahead and hit that like and subscribe button. There's so much amazing content on here that is coming to you. So many new shows now available here on World Championship Wreckage as well. Check them all out. And like I say, just hit that like and subscribe button. And hey, if you like the content you see here, why don't you head on over to Cole TV. Cole TV, we have 2 weekly shows dedicated to professional wrestling. First, we have Pro Wrestling 60, where we recap everything that happened in the world of professional wrestling that past week, as well as our show Learning the Ropes, where we take a look back at the history of professional wrestling. And not only do we have the professional wrestling content, but we have all sorts of specials and vlogs about not only pro wrestling, but all sorts of other content as well. So why don't you come on over and join the revolution that is Cole TV. Once again, I'm XLJ the OG, and that is going to be a wrap for this episode of Back in the Day. And as I always say, we'll see you at the matches.